Before we begin, take a deep breath. Let the day slow down. Wherever you are, whether you're lying in bed, resting in a quiet room, or just looking for a gentle way to drift off, you're welcome here. If you enjoy falling asleep to the forgotten corners of history, remember to subscribe to this channel and feel free to share in the comments. What time is it where you are? And where in the world are you listening from tonight? Now, let's wander quietly back into the past. No rush, no pressure, just a slow story to keep you company while you rest. Imagine you're standing in the heat of the Roman Forum. The marble columns shimmer slightly in the sunlight, and the air smells of dust, olives, and old blood. People pass by you, merchants, senators, slaves, some stopping at a public board to read the Acta Diurna, Rome's daily notices. But today, your eyes are drawn to something else entirely. A leather sack, large enough to hold a man, lies tied at the base of a platform. Guards stand nearby. You ask a nearby citizen what's happening, and he responds calmly. A man killed his father. Parricide, the act of killing one's own parent, was among the worst crimes in ancient Rome, and it came with one of the strangest punishments ever recorded in history. The poena culi, or penalty of the sack, was not just a punishment. It was a statement, a rejection, a public unpersoning. But Rome didn't start with sacks and snakes. The roots of Roman punishment began with practicality. Early Roman law, such as the 12 Tables written around 450 BCE, emphasized compensation, property disputes, and oaths. Blood punishment wasn't the norm, but parricide offended not just the family, it offended the gods. Roman law held that killing a parent wasn't simply a crime against flesh and blood, but a disruption of the divine and ancestral order. Family, familia, wasn't merely social, it was sacred. The paterfamilias, or male head of the household, represented the bridge between the gods, the ancestors, and the future. To murder him was to attack Roman civilization itself. And so, beginning, perhaps in the late Republic and becoming standard by the early Empire, the poena culi became Rome's most shocking sentence. The criminal would not be executed by sword or fire, no simple crucifixion or exile. Instead, they would be stripped of all identity. First, the criminal would be beaten, humiliated, and marched publicly. Then, before the city, he would be placed inside a leather sack, along with a specific collection of animals, each symbolically chosen: a dog, a snake, a monkey, and a rooster. Each animal carried its own meaning. The dog, once a guardian, now snarling. The snake, deception. The monkey, mockery of humanity. The rooster, the false herald of the sun, bringing no light to what would follow. Inside the sack, the man was crammed with them, tied tight, no way out, no air, no prayer. And then they threw the sack into the river. Why the river? Because it belonged to the gods. The river cleansed the city of its offense, and the body of the murderer was denied the earth. No tomb, no urn, no memory, nothing for the ancestors to recognize. But the details of this punishment changed over time. Not every criminal received all 4 animals. Some sacks were filled with only snakes. Others used only dogs and monkeys, depending on the region and period. Roman legal texts, including those by Ulpian and Modestinus, offer variations, debates, even rare commutations. The law wasn't just about consistency, it was about spectacle, and the people watched. not because they found pleasure in it, but because it taught a lesson. To the Romans, law was not a cold institution, it was theatre. And this sack, this mixture of madness and symbolism, was one of its strangest acts. We don't know the names of most who suffered this fate. In fact, records of individual cases are rare. That was part of the punishment, erasure. But the procedure endured for centuries, even as emperors rose and fell, even as gods changed and calendars shifted, the sack remained. There is something haunting in the image. Not just the drowning, not just the animals, but the silence, the sealed leather, pulled tight, the sack sinking, slowly into the Tiber, disappearing beneath Rome's bridges, swallowed by muddy waters. What kind of society would preserve such a punishment for so long? What did the Romans fear more than a murderer? That they would forget what order looked like. And yet, beneath the cruelty lies a question. Did the sack truly stop anyone? Or did it only quiet our fear of becoming like them? The Roman Empire, vast and sprawling, was an empire built not only with stones and soldiers, but with laws, rules meant to define the unthinkable. And one of the most disturbing was poenacule, the punishment of the sack. But why, out of all the elaborate and brutal Roman penalties, did this one last so long? Why did emperors, scholars, and even Christian thinkers defend it for centuries? To understand this, we must travel back again. This time, not to a dusty forum, but into the minds of Roman jurists and philosophers who shaped ideas of justice long after the Republic fell. The sack punishment wasn't just designed to kill. It was designed to unmake someone. By placing the criminal into a bag with animals, Rome denied him everything. He lost his human status. The sack was not just leather, it was a coffin of shame. To die inside it, without burial or even touch of soil, was to be stripped of identity and eternity. Roman law placed enormous weight on memory. A man's name was preserved on tombstones, in wills, in family trees, in statues. Even slaves who earned freedom could leave a mark. But the man in the sack, forgotten, unmarked. The animals served as symbols of his descent, his fall below beast. Legal scholars of the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, like Ulpian and Paulus, kept the punishment alive by embedding it in commentaries. Their works were studied by later jurists and would even influence medieval and early modern law. Ulpian, a noted jurist during the reign of Emperor Severus Alexander, wrote that the punishment for parricide must be extraordinary, not because the crime was common, but because it defied nature. Killing one's parent was not merely a legal violation, it was cosmic. He emphasized that the sack's horror was its ritual isolation. No burial rites, no mourners, no markers. The Romans believed in pietas, a sacred duty to family and gods. A parricide destroyed both. Later, the Christian Empire could have abolished the practice, but instead it preserved it. Even as Rome Christianized, under Constantine and his successors, the poenacule remained. Augustine of Hippo, one of Christianity's most important early theologians, referenced it without rejection. By the 4th and 5th centuries, legal codes like the Codex Theodosianus and later Corpus Juris Civilis under Justinian still listed the sack among acceptable punishments. There's a subtle reason for this. The sack punishment fit both pagan and Christian logic. For pagans, it was divine balance, an erasure of pollution. For Christians, it was a moral parable. The idea of being swallowed cut off or cast into the waters, had parallels in scripture, from Jonah to Judas. Some even likened the punishment to being cast out of God's grace, drowning in one's own guilt, surrounded by creatures that mocked, the soul's fall from grace. But beyond theology, there were also practical reasons the sack punishment survived. The Roman elite saw it as a tool of political stability. Fathers in Rome were authority figures, landholders, and legal heads. If one son could kill a father and survive with honor, others might follow. The poena culae wasn't only a punishment, it was a warning to all households. Respect the chain of power. Over time, the sack became rarer. Records in late antiquity are sparse. As the Western Empire collapsed in the 5th century, some regions likely abandoned the practice. But in the East, especially under Byzantine rule, the punishment flickered on in legal texts. One of the last known confirmed uses of the poena culae took place in Germany in the 18th century. Yes, 18th. The Holy Roman Empire, shaped by Roman law, carried over this ancient punishment. Though it evolved, some variations removed the animals or used different combinations, the idea remained. A sack, a body, a river. There are reports of a man being executed by sack in 1749 in Saxony. Though it is debated whether the animals were used, the form remained disturbingly intact. That's nearly 2,000 years of tradition from Republic Rome to Enlightenment Europe. What other punishment can claim that kind of continuity? Even in modern times, the imagery lingers. In literature, the idea of being trapped in a bag, suffocating, beside beasts, has haunted authors and readers alike. It has appeared in Gothic fiction, horror films, even metaphors for social exile. And yet, for all its weight, we rarely ask, why animals? Why not just throw the man into the river alone? Some scholars believe the animals weren't just symbolic, they were instruments of chaos. A man crammed into a tight sack with a dog and a snake had no peace in his final moments. Panic, scratching, biting, suffocation. It ensured a terrifying and dehumanizing death. Others argue it was Rome's final act of control. By choosing the death, the contents, the ritual, Rome controlled not just justice, but fear. And still, a quiet thought lingers in the back of the mind. What did the river was quiet? Not always. At times it raged, when the rains swelled its banks and the sewers overflowed. But most days, the Tiber moved like time, slow, brown, and indifferent. And into this river, for centuries, Rome cast not only its waste and its warships, but its deepest shame. The poena culae, the punishment of the sack, was not about the condemned man. It was about what Rome wanted others to see, and what it wanted to forget. For those watching the execution, there was no speech from the condemned. The mouth was often bound. No appeals, no dramatic farewells. The executioner did not raise a sword. There was no final gory moment to fix in memory. There was only a sack, a writhing leather shape, then the sound of it hitting water, and then nothing. This silence was key. Most Roman executions were noisy, shouts in the arena, public beatings, metal against bone. But the sack was quieter, colder, more erasure than execution, as if the man had not only died, but had been disassembled, made unreal. By the time of Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century CE, the punishment was formally standardized. Jurists like Gaius and Pomponius recorded versions of the crime and its retributions. Even as laws became more organized, the sack remained like a ritual relic, old, strange, and untouched by reforms. We know it was feared, but was it effective? That's harder to prove. Roman historians didn't dwell on statistics. There's no data showing how many parricides were prevented. Instead, we have fragments, an inscription here, a law text there, a Christian letter in another province. One tale survives of a woman who informed on her own son. She had overheard him conspiring with a friend to poison his father. Rather than silence the crime, she turned him in. The Roman court ordered his execution by sack. The mother reportedly fainted when the verdict was announced. Her own son, drowned, with beasts, but she insisted it be carried out. That's the Roman mind. Duty above grief. Yet for all its formality, the poena culi began to fade from daily life. By the 3rd century, Rome faced greater chaos, plagues, invasions, economic collapse. Massive purges and executions followed under emperors like Caracalla and Maximinus Thrax, and later under Diocletian. These emperors favored swift, public punishments, beheadings, crucifixions, burnings. The sack was too quiet for empire-wide fear, but it didn't die. In the eastern provinces, especially those steeped in older Roman law codes, the punishment lingered in texts. In places like Antioch, legal students continued to study Justinian's laws into the 6th and 7th centuries, even as their relevance waned. The poena culi became a ghost, a lesson rather than a law. And still it whispered forward through time. Medieval. Europe rediscovered Roman law in the 11th and 12th centuries. The Corpus Juris Civilis was copied and taught in Bologna and Paris. Scholars puzzled over this strange punishment. Some attempted to Christianize it, arguing the animals symbolized the 4 evangelists gone mad. Others found the idea of animals too crude, too pagan. But in some corners of the Holy Roman Empire, local laws adopted it nearly verbatim. In 1474, a German man named Hans von Katzenelnbogen was executed for killing his mother. He was sewn into a sack with a dog, a rooster, and a cat. He was thrown into the Rhine. The river did not return him. Even in this echo, the ritual remained intact. Animals, water, erasure. But eventually, the Enlightenment came. Rationalism, human rights, and the question, what is justice? By the 18th century, the idea of being executed with animals seemed grotesque, primitive. Jurists in France and Prussia denounced it. The last known confirmed use, though debated, was in 1749 in Saxony, when a man convicted of parricide was sentenced to the sack. Some say the animals were symbolic only. Others claim they were present. The records are unclear. The silence returned. And then, the law books moved on. Today, the poena culi is taught only in obscure legal history classes. It appears in footnotes, in lectures about symbolic punishment, in museum exhibits beside rusty shackles and forgotten scrolls. Most people have never heard of it. Fewer still believe it was real. But the truth remains. For nearly 2,000 years, one of the most terrifying punishments in human history was not a torture device or a pit of lions, but a sack, filled with animals, breath, and silence. It wasn't designed to scare the criminal. It was designed to terrify everyone watching, to remind them that some crimes removed you from the world so completely, not even your bones would remain. The Tiber continues to flow. Barges pass beneath bridges. Tourists walk the banks. The silt has long buried any trace of the sacks, but somewhere, beneath the mud perhaps, lies a bone, a fragment of leather, a chicken feather, a tooth. Time doesn't forget, only we do. You walk into the grand public baths of ancient Rome, and the first thing you notice is the heat. Not just warmth, but an enveloping steam that clings to the skin. Marble floors slick with condensation, voices echo in the mist, and bronze braziers hiss with freshly ladled water. The thermae, as they were called, were more than bathhouses. They were temples of leisure, power, and cleanliness. But for one man, they became something else entirely. Not a place to unwind, not a place to socialize, but a furnace, a chamber of death. And the man responsible: Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the infamous Roman emperor whose name would become synonymous with cruelty, performance, and fire. Most people remember Nero for fiddling while Rome burned, but history offers stranger details, like how he turned a luxurious steam room into a slow, agonizing death trap. Let us go back, not to the flames of Rome, but to the suffocating stillness of its baths. In the 1st century CE, during Nero's reign, public baths had become architectural marvels. The baths of Agrippa and the Stabian baths in Pompeii had set the standard, but Nero, always keen to outdo his predecessors, had more extravagant plans. In the Domus Aurea, his golden house, he commissioned private bathing suites unlike anything in the city. Vaulted ceilings covered in gold leaf, mosaics of sea monsters, fountains with wine instead of water. Here, in these luxury spaces, Nero held meetings, staged performances, and, according to some historians, dealt out punishments. One such punishment has lingered in Roman rumor and historical whisper: the boiling of a man alive in the Caldarium, the hottest chamber in the Roman bath complex. Was this execution symbolic, accidental, deliberate? The Roman historian Suetonius, in his often gossipy Lives of the Caesars, wrote that Nero once punished a freedman accused of theft and betrayal by forcing him into a sealed caldarium. He was not tossed into a boiling cauldron, but rather sealed. Inside the steaming, suffocating room, its vents blocked, the fire below stoked high. The temperature in a typical caldarium could exceed 50 degrees, 122 degrees on a regular day. But with the doors sealed and the heat intensified, it could reach far more lethal levels. The freedman reportedly screamed until he couldn't. The marble sweat benches scalded his skin. The air itself became impossible to breathe. He suffocated, boiled, and was eventually found curled beside the water basin, skin blistered and lungs collapsed. Was it legal? No. Was it theatrical? Absolutely. Was it unique to Nero? Perhaps not. Roman baths were, in many ways, stages. And Nero fancied himself a playwright. Nero's reputation for cruelty extended beyond this incident. He executed senators for suspected slights, banished his own mother before having her killed, and watched as political enemies were strangled, poisoned, or starved. But the bathhouse punishment stood out because of its intimacy. It was not the impersonal death of battle or the spectacle of the arena. It was something slower, hotter, quieter, a perversion of something the Romans considered sacred: bathing. For Romans, bathing was... Nero's Rome was not a city of silence. Chariots roared down stone-paved roads. Public orators shouted beneath columns. Vendors called out for bread and olives. But in Nero's private baths, when the doors were bolted and the vents sealed, silence took on a different form. It was the kind of silence that burned. The caldarium was supposed to cleanse. The hot air, the damp stone, the pools. Everything was meant to purify body and soul. Yet in the hands of a man like Nero, it became something else entirely. Something theatrical, something terrifying. The freedman who perished inside, his name long lost, became a symbol of this distortion. His crime, likely treachery or betrayal, might have warranted a trial, even exile. But Nero wasn't a man of trials. He was a man of scenes. The bath wasn't a tool of justice. It was a stage for spectacle. And what made it so frightening wasn't the fire. It was the familiarity. People had always entered the caldarium to relax. They knew the soft rhythm of dripping water, the way the heat gathered in their bones, the buzz of voices muffled by steam. There was comfort in the routine. Undress, oil the body, scrape off sweat with a strigil, step into the hot room, breathe deeply, rinse, cool down. But after that man died, the routine was stained. The silence of the baths, once meditative, now felt unsafe. What if the heat rose too high? What if the door stuck? What if the attendants disappeared and didn't return? In this way, Nero's punishment wasn't just one death. It was a warning, soaked into the stone itself. Anyone might vanish in the mist. Roman sources describe Nero's obsession with control through perception. He didn't always kill to remove enemies. He killed to send a message. The slow death in the caldarium did not produce a bloodied corpse to parade through the forum, but it whispered fear through the city's most beloved space. And that fear spread beyond the Golden House. The public baths, especially the thermae, of Nero, completed around 62 CE, were marvels of design. They included gymnasiums, libraries, and open courtyards. Anyone could enter, from slaves to senators. But the elite knew that some areas were reserved. Quiet wings, private pools, hotter rooms. And it was here, in the exclusivity of marble and gold, that punishments could be disguised as accidents. Suetonius, Tacitus, and later Cassius Dio write not of laws being passed or edicts proclaimed, but of examples being made. A senator who mocked Nero's poetry disappeared after a late-night invitation to bathe. Another, a freedman whose wealth rivaled the emperor's, collapsed in a sealed room before ever stepping into the pool. Witnesses were few. Causes of death, vague. Ivoire, genius of it lay in the naturalness of it all. People fainted in baths. People died of heat stroke. No guards needed, no blades drawn. Just a closed door and silence. Behind this cruelty was Nero's fascination with theatricality. He fancied himself an actor, a singer, a poet. He performed on stage for adoring crowds, forced senators to applaud his verses, and commissioned sculptures of himself as Apollo, the god of music and light. But like a true dramatist, he also knew the power of death as performance. If a man was to die, let him die in a way that others would never forget, even if they never saw it. The caldarium, then, became an instrument not just of execution, but of rumor. In Rome, where senators whispered and slaves gossiped, a man dying of heat in Nero's bath became a legend. Each retelling added something more. that the floor had been salted to burn the skin, that the fire had been fed with perfumed wood so that his final breaths were sweet and choking, that attendants sat calmly outside, listening until the silence came. But what of the bathhouses themselves? After Nero's death in 68 CE, following a coup and his own assisted suicide, the empire attempted to erase him. His palaces were dismantled. The Domus Aurea was buried beneath the baths of Tryon. His golden statues were melted down. The Senate declared him an enemy of the state. Yet oddly, the baths survived. His public bath complex remained open, at least for a time. Later emperors expanded and rebuilt, erecting the even more magnificent baths of Titus, Trajan, and eventually Caracalla. Inscriptions from the time barely mention the deaths that may have occurred in their steam rooms. The architecture stayed. The fear drifted into memory. Roman law never codified steam death as a legal sentence. There was no formal death by caldarium in the Lex Julia or later legal texts. This was not official policy. It was imperial whim, which made it harder to protest. There is one account, recorded in a 2nd century letter, that a philosopher refused to bathe in the emperor's caldarium after Nero's death. When asked why, he reportedly replied, "Because marble remembers," a quiet phrase, a refusal to forget. And perhaps that's what lingers most. Not the heat, not the architecture, but the idea that anything beautiful can be weaponized if the wrong man holds the key. The steam still rises in Roman ruins today. In Pompeii, you can walk the narrow halls of the ancient baths, see the soot-blackened ceilings, touch the warm stone that once radiated heat. It's quiet, peaceful. But when you close the door behind you and imagine the heat rising, it doesn't feel so peaceful anymore. How many other rituals in history were turned, quietly, permanently, into tools of fear? The walls of Rome have heard many things. The chants of triumph after a military conquest, the wails of mourning during plague years, the whispers of conspiracy in shaded courtyards. But perhaps the strangest sounds, if one could still hear them, are the sounds left behind in the steam. The sound of a man dying not from blade or poison, but from silence and heat. By the time Nero's life ended in humiliation and chaos in 68 CE, the story of the bathhouse deaths had already spread through the empire. Whether or not each detail was true became less important than what the stories meant. Nero had not only tortured people, he had corrupted places. The caldarium, a sacred space of relaxation and community, had become, in some corners of Rome, a place of dread. Yet after his death, Rome did not burn down the baths. The thermae of Nero remained. Parts of his Domus Aurea were sealed, and later built over, but the idea of bathing, public, shared, ritualized, was too essential to Roman life. The architecture adapted. New emperors built bigger, grander complexes. The baths of Trajan, and later the baths of Caracalla, rose in scale and opulence. Mosaics glittered with gods. Pools were arranged geometrically for maximum flow and grandeur, but something had changed. An anecdote from the reign of Emperor Titus, Nero's successor, offers a curious hint. A disgraced noble, long thought dead, reappeared in the city and was allowed to live quietly in the countryside. When asked why he avoided the capital's baths, he allegedly responded, "I bathe where no one listens for silence." The phrase is odd, but telling. The bathhouse, once a place of conversation and communal washing, had gained a memory of death. even if the heating systems had changed, and even if the new emperors insisted they had cleansed the past with new marble, the concept remained. If power could turn the most comforting places into coffins, nowhere was truly safe. Some Roman writers hinted that the bathhouse executions continued quietly into the Flavian dynasty, though not in official records. References appear in satirical poetry and moral essays, vague enough to escape censure, but sharp enough to make a point, and the system that made it possible was never dismantled. The hypocaust, the underfloor, heating system that warmed the baths, was marvelously efficient. Tunnels under the floor circulated hot air controlled by slave labor. The prefernium, the furnace room, could be stoked at will. All it took was a few extra logs, a blocked vent, and a closed door to transform therapy into terror. What made it terrifying wasn't only its invisibility, it was its plausibility. Roman engineering had made heat into a science. Everything was calculated. How many slaves to fuel the fire? How much air to circulate? How long to warm the room? There was beauty in the system, unless someone decided to bend it. The truth is that the Romans had, perhaps for the first time in history, created a public institution that could kill without a mark. A man could walk into a bathhouse and never come out, not from stabbing or strangling, but from something as simple as staying too long. And because there was no blade, there was no blood, no law broken, just one less voice in the steam. By the late 2nd century CE, the story of Nero's bathing executions had become part of Rome's whispered law. Teachers used the tale to illustrate the dangers of unchecked power. Poets referenced the silence of steam in critiques of imperial arrogance, and bathhouses themselves became divided into zones of trust, public wings where slaves and citizens mingled, and private chambers where the powerful watched closely. But for the average Roman, life went on. Bathing remained central. People still. One German historian, writing in the 1600s, concluded that wherever heat is controlled by the hands of men, it may serve both gods and devils. It's an old idea. Tools don't kill, people do. But it also reveals a deep Roman truth, that power, if left unshaped by law, will find any chamber to hide in, even one filled with steam. Today, you can walk through the ruins of ancient Roman bathhouses. You can see the scorched brick arches of the furnaces, the raised floors where warm air once flowed. You can imagine men sitting quietly in the caldarium, their backs against marble, their skin damp with sweat. And somewhere in the quiet, if you listen long enough, you might remember that once, just once, or perhaps many times, someone entered that chamber and never came out. Not because of an accident, not because of poor health, but because an emperor turned heat into silence. The Roman Empire knew how to kill. It knew how to crucify, how to strangle, how to burn. It mastered the art of execution, not just to punish the guilty, but to instruct the living. Yet among the many ways that Rome silenced its enemies, one method remains largely forgotten. So brutal, so specific, and so quiet, it rarely appears. In the grand narratives of history, it is the punishment historians now call execution by the gagged saw. There are few records. No surviving statute in the 12 tables, no inscription etched in triumph. Only a series of whispers, scattered references in early Christian martyrologies, obscure Roman commentaries, and scattered imperial legal fragments that speak of a saw used not for carpentry, but for silence, not on a battlefield, not in an amphitheater, but in basements, barns, stone cellars beneath villas. The saw was not always a tool of execution. In most of the Roman world, it was practical, a craftsman's necessity. Romans built with wood and stone alike. They sawed planks for ships, beams for roofs, and scaffolds for temples. But in the darker corners of Roman justice, those parts that did not welcome daylight, the saw became a tool of fear. Let us begin not with a spectacle, but with a whisper from the reign of Emperor Caligula. In 39 CE, the Emperor Gaius, known to history as Caligula, had become increasingly paranoid. He believed that conspiracies lurked in every corridor, that noble families plotted his fall, and that informants were never far behind. Under his reign, arrests multiplied. Executions too. But some punishments were not public. One senator, whose name was stricken from records but whose estate survived in fragments of land deeds, was accused of tacita perduelio, treason by silence. According to a surviving commentary by a 2nd century legal writer, this man was accused not of plotting, but of withholding knowledge of a conspiracy. He had said nothing when he should have spoken, and in the eyes of Caligula, silence was complicity. He was sentenced to die not by the sword, but by the saw. It is said the method was deliberate. The man was tied upside down, ankles bound, mouth gagged so tightly no sound could escape. And then, slowly, the saw began, starting at the groin and moving downward through the midline, using gravity to assist in the work. The executioners were trained not for speed, but for endurance, because the gag ensured that no scream would escape, and that was the point. The punishment was not just the pain, it was silence imposed on silence. Some historians question whether this happened in Rome itself, or in outlying provinces like Syria or Hispania, where Roman governors operated with more freedom and brutality, but the references accumulate across centuries. In a letter attributed to the early Christian scholar Lactantius, he references those who died not in flame, nor under lions, but in the quiet gnaw of iron teeth. The phrase is metaphorical, perhaps, but in context, it may point to saw execution, rare, shocking, and effective in spreading fear without ever touching a public square. In truth, the punishment was never formalized. It was used not to display power, but to send a chilling message that the empire could silence you so thoroughly, no one would ever hear your death. There are fragments of similar stories recorded in Christian martyr accounts, though often stylized and soaked in metaphor. One account tells of a convert in Ephesus who was taken by night, bound in a cellar, and divided by saw as the world slept. Another story tells of a slave who revealed the misdeeds of his master and was sentenced by the local magistrate to judicium feri taciti, judgment of the silent iron. The saw was not wielded in a forum, it was wielded in shadow. What's important to understand is that this method of execution was not about ending life quickly. It was about control, slow, private control. The gag, always mentioned in these tales, served multiple purposes. It prevented screaming. It prevented praying. It prevented any final words. In a society obsessed with legacy, this was crueler than death. Roman men, especially senators, generals, magistrates, wanted their last words remembered. They wanted to die in public, with dignity, quoting Homer or Cicero. But to be sawed in silence, mouth stuffed with cloth or wax or even your own toga, was to be denied final memory. And that may be why the punishment was so rare. It was not efficient. It was not practical. It required secrecy, skilled executioners, and a willingness to hear the sound of iron teeth for hours. But for emperors like Caligula, Nero, or Domitian, men who sought not just obedience, but utter fear, it was a tool that served precisely once per audience, because once was enough. There are no surviving saws in Roman museums labeled execution, tool. But in the ruins of one villa near Baiae, archaeologists found a cellar with strange markings on the floor, deep grooves in the stone aligned in a straight line, ending near a rust-stained drain. The room had no windows, no frescoes, nothing decorative, just stone, damp, and echoes. Did the saw echo here? No one can say for sure. But what is left unsaid sometimes says the most. What makes this punishment so difficult to trace is its deliberate erasure. Roman justice was often public, recorded, celebrated. But this punishment left little behind. That, perhaps, was its true function: to destroy a man without memory, to silence not just his voice, but his existence. And yet, the stories survived. In broken texts, in whispered traditions, in warnings passed between households, which leaves us with a strange contradiction. How can a punishment designed to silence echo for so long? The Roman Empire was meticulous about its punishments: crucifixion for slaves and traitors, beheading for Roman citizens, exile for the well-connected, public floggings, arena deaths, garrotings, all of it carefully structured, in layers of class, crime, and spectacle. But the gagged saw defied this structure. It existed somewhere outside the code, yet never quite beyond belief. That's what made it terrifying. You could not appeal against it, because it was not written. You could not prepare for it, because it was not expected. And you could not speak of it, because those who did often disappeared. By the time of Domitian's reign at the end of the 1st century CE, the empire had returned to a kind of surface-level stability. Domitian presented himself as a strict moralist, reviving old Roman virtues, strengthening the economy, restoring temples. But underneath, Rome was haunted again by purges. Domitian's rule saw dozens of senators executed, banished, or quietly removed. He governed by fear, using spies and informants to maintain absolute control. And according to several accounts, Pliny the Younger, Juvenal, and later Dio Cassius, he revived more unofficial forms of punishment. In a passage from a private letter Pliny wrote after Domitian's death, he refers to those who perished, without trial, without name, without flame, the iron whisper. Though the phrase is cryptic, it has led some historians to interpret it as a reference to the saw. The logic was cruelly simple. If silence was the crime, then the punishment must be silence too. Let's pause and consider how this punishment might have been carried out. There was no courtroom, no scroll bearing the accused's name, no executioner in a crimson tunic wielding the fasces of lawful punishment. Instead, a small group of men, a location away from the forum, perhaps an estate's lower level, a soldier's storage room, a magistrate's private warehouse. The condemned would be restrained upside down, ankles bound tightly, arms tied above the head, but useless in that position. The gag came next. Soaked in water, sometimes dipped in vinegar to burn the throat, always thick enough to stifle sound. Then came the saw, not a jagged tool of crude torture, but a sharp-toothed carpenter's blade, long enough to span 2 hands, held by 2 men, working in rhythm, slowly, soaring downward from the groin along the body's center line. Why upside down? Because gravity pulled the blood toward the brain, keeping the victim conscious for far longer than if they'd started from the top. It was not quick. It was not quiet for the executioners. But to the outside world, it was as though nothing happened. Because the man who died by saw was often not recorded. No funeral rites, no inscriptions, no public record. His crime might have been petty, an insult, a refusal to inform, a poorly timed silence. But in the eyes of the emperor, it was enough. And, in a society where being remembered was life after death, erasure was a sentence far worse than execution. But this method was not always used on the elite. There are rare and fragmentary references in provincial scrolls to slaves and laborers being punished with the iron split. One legal fragment from Gaul mentions a runaway slave who, after being accused of theft and aiding in the escape of others, was returned to the house and divided beneath the workshop roof. It's possible this too refers to the gagged saw. Why would such a punishment be used on a slave? Because sometimes cruelty was meant to frighten more than a single class. If a master wanted to make sure none of his remaining slaves entertained the idea of escape or betrayal, a quiet death, hidden from the public, known only by rumor, could do more damage than a dozen lashings in the street. What makes the punishment so unnerving is not just its horror, but its psychology. Most Roman executions served to display authority. The crucifix was a warning along the roads. The arena displayed imperial strength, but the gagged saw hid power. It whispered it. It turned death into a riddle, and riddles travel further than proclamations. People filled in the gaps. They whispered about the senator who vanished after opposing a grain tax, about the freedwoman who mocked the emperor's statue and never returned from the magistrate's villa, about the letter carrier who knew too much about a failed rebellion and was sick before dawn. Were they sawed? No one knew. And that's why the punishment survived, not in law books, but in fear. We find a final mention of this method not in Rome, but centuries later, in a Latin manuscript compiled by a monk in the 6th century CE near Ravenna. It's a collection of anecdotes about martyrs and sinners. One entry tells of a young man who betrayed the bishop's trust and was cut without voice in the cellar, never to be spoken of again. Fact or fable? Who can say? But even as the empire fell and the baths crumbled and law gave way to legend, the saw remained, because every society needs a silence it cannot explain. And perhaps that is what the gagged saw truly represents. Not justice, not even cruelty, but a fear so deep it could only be spoken in whispers. In the end, the saw did not survive in law. It did not outlast the emperors who ordered it, nor the brick sellers where it may have echoed for hours, nor the hushed stories that passed between frightened lips. But the idea of it, that people could be not simply killed, but unmade, erased through silence and method, remains among the most disturbing truths of ancient Rome. Because execution by the gagged saw wasn't just about pain, it was about control, total, final, irretrievable control. When someone was beheaded, their death was seen. When someone was crucified, their body became a message. But when someone was gagged, inverted and sawed, they were not a body. They were not a message. They were an object, a silent thing being processed, slowly, carefully into nothing. No last words. No visible blood in the forum. No burning scent in the Colosseum air. Only the sound of teeth scraping down the spine somewhere beneath the floorboards. By the early 2nd century CE, emperors like Trajan and Hadrian worked hard to recenter justice within the legal system. They reduced arbitrary executions, formalized court proceedings, and tried, at least on paper, to present themselves as rational, philosophical rulers. But that only pushed punishments like the sword deeper into the shadows. Did the emperors themselves still order such deaths? Possibly not. But the governors did, the secret police, the handlers of dissidents and informants in frontier provinces like Britannia, Syria, Numidia. There, far from the center, a method of death that left no mark on public records was invaluable. And so, while we have no edict, no stone carving that says, "This man was sword," we do have something stranger, the conspicuous absence of certain people. You'll find it in provincial ledgers, lists of tax collectors, magistrates, and tribunes whose entries simply stop. No death date, no transfer, no reassignment, only a blank. Sometimes followed, days later, by a record of a reward to a soldier, or an ex gratia payment to a servant, or the release of funds for restructuring of storage areas. You begin to see the shape of something beneath the page. In a private villa near Capua, archaeologists found a wooden table, long rotted, with iron filings embedded in the floor beneath it. The table had been set over a drain. The room had no mosaics, no frescoes, just cut stone with a slightly bowed floor designed for runoff. Was it a butcher's chamber, a winemaker's press, or something else? We don't know. But we do know this. The saw wasn't designed for public death. It was designed for final death. The kind that didn't need an audience. The kind that left no story behind. Except one. That somewhere, someone once said too little or too much, and their breath was taken by metal and fear. The gag, more than the saw, became the symbol of this punishment. Because in Roman life, speech was power. The spoken word was used in contracts, in law, in oaths to the gods. A Roman could lose land, family, or freedom with the wrong phrase. To be denied speech at the moment of death was to be denied Roman identity itself. Worse than the pain was the erasure of legacy. To die without voice was to vanish. And so, among the quiet elite, those who wrote poetry under cautious names, who debated ethics under heavy curtains, the idea of the gagged saw endured as a caution, not of death, but of forgetting. You could lose everything in Rome and still rebuild, but if you were gagged, silenced, and split in secret, you were not just gone, you had never been. Even centuries later, long after the empire fractured, whispers of the method appear again. In 13th century legal texts from Italy, certain punishments are euphemistically referred to as la separazione muta, the mute separation. Inquisition records refer to the punishment of tearing down the center for heretics who would not confess. In some obscure cases, the saw seems to reappear, not just as tool, but as ritual. The logic remained. When someone is dangerous, not for what they did, but for what they know or what they refuse to say, they are to be silenced completely. And if that meant cutting them in half, so be it. What does this say about the civilization that once called itself eternal? Rome gave us roads, Aqueducts, language, law. It built an empire that outlasted itself in name, influence, and structure. But in its darkest corners, it also gave us something else. A method of death so complete, so invisible, so personal, that it survives only in the gaps of history. The saw never needed to be displayed. It only needed to be feared. And so, across time, the shape of that fear remains. A dark room, an iron blade, a body bound, and silence. If you stood at the edge of Rome and followed the roads outward, those legendary stone arteries that connected empire to province, city to frontier, you might, on certain mornings, stumble upon a sight that chilled even the hardest Roman heart. A crossroads, two dirt paths intersecting, and there, nailed to a rough beam in the middle, a man, or what was left of him. He was not clothed, he was not named, and he was not buried. He was crucified, not on the Palatine, not on the steps of the Senate, but where the travelers passed, and the carts rumbled, and the dust of the empire never settled. And why? Because he was a slave, and worse still, a disobedient one. Crucifixion, as most know, was never the clean, tidy image often carved into later Christian art. It was a punishment designed not just to end life, but to extend death, to stretch it across hours, sometimes days. The Romans did not invent it. Persians and Carthaginians came first, but Rome perfected it, codified it, scattered it across the landscape like so many warnings written in bone. But not everyone was crucified equally. For citizens, crucifixion was unthinkable. A Roman citizen could not be nailed like a criminal. Beheading, exile, or at worst a quiet strangulation. These were considered fitting ends. But for slaves, especially dishonored ones, the punishment was far more brutal and more symbolic. Slaves, after all, were property. But dishonored slaves, they were failed property, dangerous tools. And what do you do with broken tools? You dispose of them in public. The crossroads crucifixion was not simply an execution. It was a ritualized shame. A slave who had stolen from his master, or betrayed him, or struck him, might be flogged or branded. But if a slave ran away repeatedly, aided in a rebellion, murdered a member of the household, or worse, publicly humiliated his dominus, the punishment often became crucifixion, and not just anywhere. It had to be at the crossroads, because the crossroads, in Roman belief, were liminal places, boundaries. They were neither one place nor another, neither home nor frontier. They were thresholds where the world blurred. Ghosts, spirits, and one. There's a Roman legal term from the Digest, servus damnatus ad crucem in trivio. Literally, the slave condemned to the cross at the junction of three roads. This was a specific punishment. It was reserved for certain crimes, not because they were worse, but because they had to be made visible. Imagine the morning sun rising over the Appian Way, merchants leading donkeys, soldiers heading to new postings, farmers hauling grain, and at the fork in the road, just as they must decide which way to go, there he is, hung from a crude T-shaped post, legs bent, arms stretched, a placard above his head with no name, only the crime, fugitivus, runaway. The word itself is a sentence. And why the crossroads? Because everyone must see, not just the elite, not just the army, but the poor, the old, the wandering, the enslaved. The message was clear. This is what happens when the order is broken. when a slave forgets their place. The choice of location was also theological. In Roman folk religion, crossroads were where curses were buried, where spells were cast, and where the restless dead wandered. By crucifying a slave at such a site, the Romans weren't just killing him, they were exiling him from the world. He couldn't enter the earth, he couldn't ascend to the heavens. He was pinned between, like a signpost of warning. There's a record from the reign of Tiberius of a mass crucifixion after a slave revolt in the countryside south of Rome. 77 slaves were hung at major road crossings. According to the report, the crucifixions were staggered, so that as a traveller passed through the region, he would encounter one every few miles. It took nearly a week to travel through them all. One account notes that the bodies were left until the birds had done their work. Another, that local villagers were forbidden from removing the corpses under threat of punishment. Some bodies swayed in the wind for weeks. Others slumped as nails tore through tendons. But this wasn't chaos. It was order. Rome believed in death as a system, as a lesson, as maintenance of the world's balance. And so the crossroads crucifixion became a tool, not of war, not of punishment, but of reminder. The message wasn't meant for the condemned, it was meant for the living, especially the enslaved. In Roman homes, slaves came and went like shadows, carrying water, sweeping floors, nursing children. But those who passed the crossroads could not forget what awaited them should they misstep, and those who bore the worst fates. They were not always the ones who ran away. Some were accused of nothing more than refusing to inform on their fellow slaves, for choosing silence over betrayal. And the price for that silence, a cross, at a junction, between fields and lives and memory. But what became of these crosses when the flesh fell away? Were they used again or left to rot? And what did it mean to the living to walk by the same path each day and watch the dead vanish 1 inch at a time? The Roman Empire was never short on death, but some deaths clung to the earth longer than others. At the city gates, near the outskirts of towns, and always at the crossroads, the bodies of dishonored slaves remained. Not for a day, not for a night, but for as long as nature allowed, and the nails stayed longer than that, rusting, bent, sometimes torn loose by scavengers or storms, but often still fixed in wood long after the bones were gone. Because in Rome, the punishment was never just about the dying, it was about the remaining, and few punishments remained like a slave crucified at a crossroad. Let's return to one such crossroads. We don't know its name, because it had none. Most didn't. Roman maps didn't mark crucifixion spots. The Forum was drawn in detail. So were aqueducts and triumphal arches, but not the wooden posts where bones turned black. These were not for celebration, they were for reminders. Along the Via Latina, not far from what is now southern Lazio, archaeologists uncovered deep post holes, cut into limestone and clay. The placement was too symmetrical for accident, too clustered for farming. Several bore fragments of iron, bone and char. One hole even held a thick black stain in the shape of a human torso, left by rain, rot and time. Nearby, they found broken amphorae, bread crusts, olive pits, signs of daily traffic. People passed this place. They walked by it, lived near it, sold figs within sight of it, and the crosses stood. Crossroads crucifixions weren't about law. They were about warning systems. In an empire where slaves outnumbered free citizens in some regions, especially in agricultural zones like Sicily, Campania, and parts of North Africa, the potential for revolt was constant. The fear wasn't unfounded. Spartacus had led tens of thousands against Rome barely a century earlier, and his memory haunted Roman minds. So the Senate didn't just rely on prisons or patrols, it relied on fear stitched into the geography. The idea was this: let the cross be your mile marker, let the nailed man be your compass. Slaves were marched past them on their way to the markets. Children pointed at them on donkey rides to nearby villages. Roman citizens saw them and felt reassurance. The land was stable. Order was visible. Pain, once performed, was eternal. But crucifixion at the crossroads was more than deterrence. It was also ritualized exclusion. Rome was obsessed with boundaries between life and death, citizen and slave, sacred and profane. Burial rites were part of this structure. Even the poorest Roman citizens were buried in designated zones outside the city, cremated if possible, remembered with small inscriptions. But for slaves crucified at crossroads, there were no tombs, no markers, no ceremonies. To bury them was a crime. In fact, some Roman jurists wrote that removing the body from the cross without permission was punishable by death. The body belonged to the state. Even in death, the slave was owned, and so they rotted, under the sun, in the wind, their fingers picked by crows, their ribs hollowed by dogs. The public grew used to it, as people always do. Roman poets, even those sympathetic to the plight of the poor, rarely mentioned crucifixions in their verses. To speak of such things was distasteful, not because it was unthinkable, but because it was so ordinary, like sewer smells, or taxes, or dust. The crucifix became background noise in the Roman countryside, yet in some rural places, small traditions emerged. Farmers would whisper when passing certain crossroads. Some poured out water as they walked by, perhaps a sign of respect, or a nervous attempt to quiet restless spirits. One 3rd century farming manual advises workers not to work soil near the Triviata stakes, crossroads poles, because the land was foul and salt-wounded. The stain of death, it seems, ran deeper than the post holes. Then there were the placards. Affixed above the condemned, they announced the crime. Some were carved into wood, others painted hastily. But they all bore one purpose: to tell everyone what law had been broken. For slaves, the wording was almost always the same: fugitivus, runaway dominum occidit, killed the master come; seditiosis, conspiravit, conspired with rebels, decoxit, destroyed or stole property. There was rarely a name. Why honor a slave with that? Names were for those who would be remembered, but the placards weren't really for the crucified. They were for the others, the slaves who lived. To see it, to read it, was to learn one's place. And what of the wood? Roman crosses were not shaped like the Christian symbol we see today. Most were simple beams, T-shaped, not symmetrical. The upright post was often reused. Only the horizontal beam, called the patibulum, was tied to the condemned's arms and carried from the holding cell to the site. The post at the crossroads rarely came down. It stood for months, sometimes years, weathered, scarred. When it rotted, another was planted. Some say the old ones were burned. Others simply left in place until the wind took them. But the nails, those were always new, forged fresh by the blacksmiths of punishment. They had to be strong enough to hold bone and flesh in place as the wind pushed against the dying. We rarely ask, What was it like to live in a village that had one? What was it like to walk past a crossroads every morning and see what the empire had done? Did the children stop looking after a while? Did the merchants grow numb to the smell? Did the slaves, those who passed closest, see their own faces in the darkened skin of the dead? Perhaps. But perhaps they did what most humans do. They learned to live around it, to give it a wide berth, to stop asking questions. And yet, the questions still linger. How long did the fear last after the bodies fell? And when the poles finally rotted, did anyone mourn? Or were they simply replaced like worn-out tools of order? The Roman Empire left few things to chance. Roads were measured, laws were written, and death, especially public death, was choreographed down to the last nail. But no matter how carefully they nailed the body to the wood, there was one thing the Romans could not control: what happened after. Because when the body began to rot, and the birds tore the eyes, and the skin turned to leather under the sun, something strange took root. Memory. Not the kind written on tablets, not the kind carved in marble, but the kind carried quietly from one mouth to another. The crucifixion at the crossroads was meant to erase the slave who had dared disobey, but instead, it sometimes made him impossible to forget. In a small village near Tibur, modern-day Tivoli, there's a 1st century funerary inscription written by a former slave named Ampliatus. The stone says little. It thanks the gods. It prays for peace. But in its final line, barely legible, it says, "And may he who hung at the eastern road..." We'll never know. But someone remembered him, enough to pay for stone, enough to challenge Rome's silence, even with nothing more than a whisper in marble. Because despite all Rome's efforts, despite its whips and beams and warnings, some memories refused to disappear. The ritual of crucifixion was designed to strip a man of identity. No tomb, no urn, no name, just bones and dust and silence. But that didn't always work. In some regions, the crosses at crossroads became local legends. Stories grew, not of the crime, but of the man. Children were told never to speak loudly when passing. Some villagers believed that the soul of the crucified lingered there, angry, unsettled. They left coins, or figs, or little scraps of cloth tied to nearby trees. Not out of reverence, but out of unease. And this was not just superstition. This was how people remembered those the empire tried to unwrite. But what of the Romans themselves, the landowners, the masters, the magistrates who ordered the deaths? To them, the crucifixion was justice in wood and blood, necessary, useful. They believed that fear was an ingredient of order, that if one slave was strung up, 100 others would fall into line, and for a time that worked. But cruelty is a poor architect, because every cross hammered into the soil also hammered something into the air. Resistance, not rebellion, not fire, but memory, private, quiet, slow, the kind of memory that becomes a murmur, then a fable, then a history no one wants to tell, but no one can forget. And what happened when Christianity spread? This is where things became strange. The symbol of the cross, once an image of shame and subjugation, became sacred. The execution beam, the implement of terror, was reclaimed. In the Christian imagination, the cross was transformed. It became not just the wood of death, but the bridge between heaven and earth. And that transformation did something to the memory of all who had died by it, even the forgotten slaves. Early Christian writings occasionally referenced unnamed crucified men, runaways, thieves, rebels, who died without trial, without dignity. Some early martyrs even insisted on dying at crossroads, imitating Christ, turning the place of shame into a place of meaning. And yet, the irony is heavy. The very structure that was once meant to erase identity became the world's most enduring symbol of redemption. But most of those crucified at Roman crossroads were not redeemed. They were not remembered in churches or prayers. They were simply gone. And that's the deeper tragedy. Today, the old roads remain. The Appian Way still stretches toward the south, flanked by cypress trees and crumbling stones. Modern footsteps echo where ox carts once rolled. And somewhere, beneath centuries of dust and grass and gravel, there are likely still holes in the ground. Post holes, wood long gone. But the shape remains. And so do the stories, not in scrolls, not in monuments, but in the absence. Because every empty place where a name should be, every village record that stops mid-line, every unmarked fork in the road, whispers that once someone stood against the empire. And the empire, in return, hung them up between sky and dirt. The Persians gave it a name, the Greeks gave it a story, and the Romans, though rarely users of it, could not stop whispering about it. Scaphism, a word that sounds soft, almost peaceful, but it was neither. It was one of the slowest, most revolting forms of execution ever conceived. And for centuries, the empire repeated its details, not because they admired it, but because they feared what it said about human cruelty. Let us begin, not in a courtroom, but in a marsh. A still, warm marsh, somewhere in the eastern parts of the Persian Empire, where reeds stand taller than men, and the air hangs thick with the smell of water, rot, and buzzing things. Here, in a shallow channel, two wooden boats, hollowed out halves, are tied together. Inside lies a man. He is naked. His arms and legs stretched out, locked between the top and bottom halves of the boats like a sandwich. Only his head, hands, and feet protrude. This is the start of scaphism, and it only gets worse from here. The earliest known record of scaphism comes from Plutarch, writing centuries after the Achaemenid period. According to his account, it was used as a punishment for treason during the reign of Artaxerxes II, sometime in the 4th century BCE. The man sentenced was Mithridates, a Persian soldier accused of killing Cyrus the Younger, Artaxerxes' brother, during a civil conflict. At first, he was celebrated. But when the king realized that Cyrus's death tarnished his own legitimacy, he ordered Mithridates executed in the most humiliating and agonizing way imaginable. And so, the boats were prepared. The procedure was deliberate. Once, confined between the vessels, the condemned was force-fed a mixture of milk and honey, gallons of it. At first, by mouth. Later, as his body refused, by funnels. The intent was to cause severe diarrhea, relentless, uncontrollable, soaking the interior of the vessel, coating his exposed limbs, dripping into the marsh. More milk and honey were rubbed onto his face, arms and feet, sweet, sticky layers that clung to the skin. And then, they waited, because scaphism was not an execution. It was a decomposition in slow motion. The flies came first. Drawn to the honey, they landed, fed, multiplied. They laid eggs in the skin. They crawled into eyes, ears, nostrils, mouth. The milk soured, the waste pooled, the stench rose, The man screamed, but no one listened. The reeds rustled, the wind shifted. But the guards stayed at a distance, only returning to pour more milk, to add more honey, to make sure the man lived. Because that was the point. This was not about speed. It was about deliberate, festering unmaking. The Romans didn't use scaphism. It wasn't a Roman method, but they talked about it, especially in the empire's eastern provinces. Roman soldiers stationed in Parthia and Syria told stories of it by firelight. Roman scholars wrote of it in their commentaries, and emperors, though they never legalized the method, threatened it in metaphor because it had become a symbol, the ultimate death, the worst thing that could be done to a man. In one legal satire from the 3rd century CE, a fictional judge tells a corrupt official, "You deserve the boats, the flies, and the milk of madness." Even in humor, the phrase was known, recognized. It meant to die not with fire or iron, but with time, with rot, with insects. How long did it take, according to Plutarch's tale? 17 days. 17 days of exposure. 17 days of burning sun and cold night. 17 days of flesh blistering, peeling, rupturing. 17 days of wasps nesting in open wounds, of maggots devouring intestines, of hallucinations from infection and dehydration, of being kept alive just enough so that death could keep watching. It is perhaps the most passive execution ever recorded. There was no whip, no blade, no fire, only waiting. But why would anyone invent such a thing? Why such cruelty? Some believe it was designed not only to punish, but to erase the condemned's legacy through shame. In Persian and early Eastern tradition, death with dignity mattered, burial mattered. A noble death was clean, sacred. But scaphism was the opposite. The man died in excrement and milk, unburied, unsung, his body bloated and picked apart, his name remembered only as a warning, and perhaps that was the goal. Not justice, but fear that echoes. But what's even more chilling is this. We don't know how many times it was used. The only full account comes from Plutarch, but other fragments, Greek, Parthian, Roman, suggest it may have occurred more than once, because things like this don't get invented whole. They evolve. A tied man left in a swamp, a criminal fed to the flies, a slow death performed, not in anger but in ritual. So how did this horror travel from Persia to the Roman mind? Through soldiers, through traders, through slaves who'd seen it, or heard of it, or claimed to. By the time Rome reached its easternmost frontiers, the image of a man sealed in boats, soaked in honey, waiting for flies, had become almost mythic. Not real, but too real to dismiss. A symbol of what happens when power is patient. But what does it say about us? That this story has never quite vanished. That even today, we remember the man who died, not by sword or flame, but by sweetness and insects. What kind of empire leaves behind not only monuments, but methods? The flies did not come all at once. They came in layers, like death itself. First, the little ones, drawn by the honey on the man's face, arms and legs. They tickled at first, then they fed. Then they began to lay eggs, eggs that hatched. Not in hours, but in minutes. The warmth of the sun and the fermented sweetness of milk accelerating nature's most merciless clock. Still, the man lived. He moaned, gagged, wept, but he lived. And that was the horror of scaphism. It needed him to live, because it was never about the act of killing. It was about prolonging the undoing of a human being. The guards had a job. not to torture, not to comfort, but to maintain. They approached at intervals, never for long. Just enough time to pour more milk and honey into the man's mouth, smear more paste onto his face and limbs, empty his back. Persia, in its rare use of scaphism, used something subtler: insects, putrefaction, the humiliation of slow decay. Plutarch wrote that those who observed the execution of Mithridates were instructed to watch silently, to take note not of his screams, but of his transformation. How a soldier of the empire, once proud and polished, could become soup for the swamp. It was the inversion of military pride. Instead of being honored with a blade or a funeral pyre, he became an offering to the lowest of creatures, not even executed like a man, but digested like waste. And Rome, watching from afar, was fascinated. Though the empire did not adopt the method, references to scaphism began to appear in unexpected places. In legal discussions about treason, the phrase "drowned in sweetness" became shorthand for punishments too cruel to name. In plays, characters threatened rivals with the swamp and the honey, always to audience gasps. Even satirical authors like Juvenal made passing allusions, comparing dishonest senators to men fit for the marsh more than the forum. The Destur image stuck, because Rome was a place that understood the body, how to break it, display it, control it, and scaphism was control by decomposition. It didn't just strip dignity, it let the world watch it rot away. What did the condemned see? For days, the view never changed. The curve of the sky, the shimmer of insects over water, the blur of trees beyond the reeds, and then closer, the ripples caused by movement below, the glint of beetles, the sudden pulse of horseflies, the constant sound, buzzing, slapping, slurping, chewing. Some accounts say men began to hallucinate within the first 48 hours. They saw faces in the clouds, heard voices in the hum, began to speak to the bugs as if they were gods or judges or family. It was a trial by nature, and nature was not kind. What does it mean then that this punishment disappeared? Because after Plutarch, the record fades. There are no surviving Persian legal codes that list scaphism. No Roman law that includes it. No surviving object, no boat, no restraint, no written tablet confirms its wide use. And yet, it lived in whispers, in metaphors, in nightmares. It became a myth of maximum suffering, so potent that its very name could empty a room. One Roman philosopher wrote that scaphism was the only death so complete that even vultures avoided the corpse, not out of pity, but because the flies had already claimed it, and there's something else. Roman scholars noticed that scaphism didn't erase a man's memory, it cemented it. Everyone forgot the names of thieves executed by hanging, or rebels crushed in battle. But the man who died over 17 days, with his own waste soaking into his flesh, people remembered him. And perhaps that was the real punishment, not just to suffer, but to become a legend of suffering. If a society invents a punishment so foul that even its own courts abandon it, does it vanish? Or does it echo louder for having never become law? And what does it mean that Rome, for all its brutality, kept scaphism at a distance, but never stopped imagining it? Long after the boats were lost, long after the man inside them dissolved into marsh and mud, scaphism remained, not as practice, but as memory. And memories, especially the cruel ones, do not always fade. They evolve, The Roman Empire never officially adopted scaphism, but it absorbed it in the way an empire does, with fascination, with imitation, and with warning. Across the provinces, whispers of the punishment grew louder with distance. The more people doubted whether it truly existed, the more terrible it became, and so scaphism outlived its own practice. By the 4th century CE, as the Roman world shifted into a Christian empire, new kinds of justice took hold. But scaphism, though never sanctioned by Roman law, appeared in theological warnings and cautionary texts. In Christian sermons, it was retold not as history, but as a metaphor for spiritual decay. "You feed the flesh with sweet things," warned one preacher in Antioch, "and the soul becomes the man in the boat." And in that metaphor, the body became a vessel, split open, filled with rot, exposed to judgment not by men, but by nature itself. The flies in these stories were sins. The milk was vanity, the honey, pride, and the man, trapped in his own choices, was left to be eaten by what he had drawn. Meanwhile, among Rome's poets and philosophers, scaphism transformed into a symbol of the worst fate imaginable. Lucan, in his darker verses, compares the slow collapse of a corrupt senator's reputation to being soaked in honey and left to the insects. Seneca, stoic and elegant, never mentions it by name, but in one of his letters he muses, "Some punishments are not swift but enduring. They do not strike the man, but invite the world to undo him piece by piece. It is worse to be dismantled than to be destroyed." And still, behind those words, lingers the boat. In private correspondence, Roman officials stationed in Armenia and Mesopotamia reference local punishments, not fit to describe in Latin. One governor, writing to his superior in Cappadocia, speaks of a local ruler who punishes thieves by filling them with milk and strapping them to troughs. Whether real or exaggerated, the implication is clear. The idea of scaphism had travelled, and it frightened those who heard it, perhaps more than crucifixion or fire ever could. Because unlike the cross, which struck fast and visible, scaphism hid its cruelty in time. It didn't shout, it hummed. Even later, Roman jurists, while never codifying scaphism, used it as a theoretical extreme. In legal debates, they proposed it as the upper boundary of punishment, never to be enacted, only to mark the edge of what was imaginable. "Let us not stray into the realm of milk and insects," wrote one legal scholar, "where law dissolves into spectacle." But law, as always, was porous. In the chaos of collapsing provinces, fading borders, and desperate warlords, the difference between spectacle and sentence could blur. And in those blurred places, something like scaphism could have easily returned. In later centuries, after the Western Roman Empire had fractured, scaphism did not die. It appeared in the writings of early Arab historians, retold as a punishment used by mad kings or foreign tyrants. In Byzantine texts, it returned as a warning, worse than the Persian death. In medieval Europe, scaphism was reduced to rumour, passed on by travelling monks, buried in manuscripts of punishments alongside drawings of wheels, racks, and boiling pots. One English monk in the 13th century described the drowning of the body in sweet decay as a fate whispered from the east, from the empires of the sun. By then, it had become myth, but not forgotten. Even today, the word scaphism survives in obscure dictionaries, grim trivia lists, horror novels. We say it casually. the worst way to die. But rarely do we stop to ask, why does this story survive? No, bodies have been found, no boats preserved, no inscriptions bearing the names of those who died this way, only one written account, centuries removed from the event. And yet, the tale endures. Because deep down, we understand what scaphism reveals, that death by nature is more terrifying than death by man, that to be nailed to wood is one thing, but to be eaten, unseen, over days, is something else. And perhaps the cruelest irony of all, the man who died in the boat, whose crime was loyalty at the wrong moment, was supposed to be erased, unnamed, forgotten. But history did not forget. Even as his flesh melted, even as his name faded, even as the empire that punished him crumbled, his death remained. Because once a punishment is imagined, that is more frightening than death itself, it becomes a kind of immortality. The crowd has gathered. Tens of thousands packed into the stone bowl of the Colosseum. The morning sun cuts across the marble benches. The sand in the arena is freshly raked. Scribes sharpen their pens. Trumpeters wet their lips. Children squirm on their fathers' laps. It's time for the games. But something is wrong. Two gladiators stand at opposite ends of the arena. They are armed, armored, trained, and yet they do not move. One drops his sword, the other kneels, and the crowd, eager for spectacle, begins to murmur. Because refusing to fight in front of the emperor, in front of Rome itself, wasn't just disobedience, it was defiance. And defiance in the Colosseum did not go unpunished. We think of gladiators as willing warriors, muscled champions saluting the crowd, calling out "Ave Caesar" before clashing in elegant duels. But the truth is more complex. Some gladiators were volunteers. Most were slaves, criminals, prisoners of war, or men condemned to fight. They trained in barracks, ate regulated diets, slept under guard. They were owned by the state or by private lanistae trainers and rented out like performers. But unlike actors, their scripts were unwritten. They were expected to kill or be killed. And when they refused, the consequences were immediate and brutal. Roman law had specific terms for those condemned to fight in the arena. Damnati ad gladium, condemned to the sword bestiari, sent to fight wild beasts, noxi. Criminals used. So what happened when he refused? When a gladiator lowered his weapon, or stood in silence, or knelt, refusing to perform? Rome had answers, and they were all designed to restore control, not just over the gladiator, but over the crowd, because the arena was not just a stage for killing, it was a tool of state messaging. If one man defied the game and walked away unharmed, the illusion of power cracked. So the punishment was immediate, and often it was creative. One common punishment was known as the fatal reprise. If a gladiator refused to fight, he would be ordered to fight again, against overwhelming odds. Sometimes this meant being thrown against multiple opponents. Other times, it meant being forced to fight animals with no armor. On one recorded occasion, a man who refused to fight was tied to a wooden post, handed a dagger, and forced to defend himself against a lion. The outcome was predictable, but the point was the crowd, to show them what happened when someone broke the spell of the spectacle. Another, even more disturbing punishment was the damnatio sine arma, condemnation without arms. The refusing gladiator would be stripped of his weapons and sent into the arena against an opponent still fully armed. Sometimes the weaponless man was allowed to run, sometimes he was not. There are mosaic depictions of this. One man kneeling, hands open, while the other raises a gladius overhead. No helmets, no shields, just silence and execution. The crowd would cheer, but not always, because even in ancient Rome, there were moments when the punishment felt excessive. Moments when the refusal felt noble, when the man who dropped his sword wasn't a coward, but something else. A rebel, a martyr, a mirror. The historian Cassius Dio recounts a notable example from the reign of Emperor Caligula. A group of condemned men, prisoners sentenced to die in the games, were handed swords and shields and led into the arena. But once inside, they stood still, refused to fight. Caligula, enraged, reportedly sent in guards to execute them all, personally overseeing the butchery, not as combat, as correction. The crowd was silent, and the lesson was clear. You may die however Rome decides, but you may not choose when, but defiance continued, and so did the penalties. Another recorded punishment involved public mutilation. The refusing gladiator might be whipped in the arena, tied to a post, and have a hand removed, then executed afterward. Others were made examples through burning, wild beasts, or mock naval battles, where they were forced to drown for sport. The punishment was always tailored for spectacle, because the point was not just death, it was the restoration of order. And yet, despite everything, gladiators still refused. Why? Some did it as a protest against cruelty, against unjust condemnation, against mockery. Others did it because they had nothing left, no family, no chance of freedom, no name. To die fighting was one thing, to die for amusement, another. And so they stood still, in defiance, in silence. What happens to an empire when even its prisoners refuse to dance? When the condemned stop playing their role, not with rebellion, but with stillness? And what does that say about the crowd? That it demands blood not for justice, but for entertainment? In a Roman arena, stillness was never neutral. A paused breath, a lowered blade, a step backward. These were not acts of hesitation. They were interpreted as statements, statements of defiance. Because once the trumpet sounded and the emperor's gaze fell across the sand, the arena no longer belonged to men. It belonged to the ritual, and rituals in Rome demanded completion. 2. Refuse to fight wasn't simply to disobey. It was to violate the script, to interrupt a machine that turned blood into order. And for that interruption, Rome had crafted a dark collection of punishments, each one more public than the last, each one designed not just to punish the body, but to reassert the empire's control over theatre itself. One of the cruelest was called the punishment of the mime. It began as a joke. It ended in silence. A gladiator who refused to fight might be handed over to the ludi scaenici, the stage performers. There, his fate was not steel, but mockery. His body would be dressed in exaggerated costume, his features painted. The arena became a comedy stage. The punishment? Death by humiliation, in the guise of performance. He would be paraded, poked, slapped, sometimes dressed as a woman or a clownish caricature of a warrior. And then, When the crowd had laughed enough, he would be killed, perhaps by wild animals, perhaps by an actor wielding a dull prop that suddenly turned real. The message was cruel and clear. If you reject the fight, you will not even be allowed a warrior's death. You will become a punchline. This idea, that death could be robbed of meaning, was central to Rome's strategy, because the worst thing a condemned man could do was claim dignity, by dying on his own terms, by refusing to entertain. So the punishment was crafted to do more than kill. It made the condemned ridiculous, to strip him of every last thread of honor before the final blow. And this wasn't always metaphorical. Another punishment involved animal pairing. When a gladiator refused to fight, he could be tied naked to a stake and left for animals trained, not to kill immediately, but to play. Bears, hyenas, trained lions, sometimes even dogs, starved and conditioned for cruelty. The arena became a slow circle of death as the animals were released one by one, not in frenzy, but in turns. The crowd would laugh, then gasp, then fall silent as the body was torn apart, slowly, deliberately, over hours. Again, the punishment wasn't about the gladiator. It was about reassuring the crowd that order had been restored. Sometimes the refusal didn't even make it to the sand. There are records of gladiators who took their own lives the night before a scheduled fight, often using hidden nails, splinters, or shards of pottery. Some suffocated themselves with tunics or slammed their heads against the walls of their cells until unconscious. One famously swallowed a sponge soaked in vinegar and suffocated slowly as his throat closed. To die before the fight was to deny Rome its show. This too was punished. The body would still be displayed, stripped, pierced, nailed to wood or bound to a chariot and dragged across the arena floor. Even in death, the state demanded a performance. But there was one punishment reserved for group refusals. Sometimes, entire troops of gladiators, usually prisoners or condemned criminals, refused en masse. In these cases, the arena authorities turned to a grim tradition, the execution line. The gladiators were lined up and forced to kill one another. Each man was handed a blade. He would turn to the man beside him and, on command, strike. If he refused, the guards did it for him. One by one, the line fell, until only one remained. He would be killed last, sometimes by a fellow gladiator, sometimes by the arena master, sometimes by a slave brought in just for the act. The purpose was psychological. It turned refusal into a blood pact, where each defiant man became a tool of another's death. The rebellion was crushed not by law, but by the bitter weight of complicity. The deeper cruelty was this. Even when Rome punished gladiators, it recorded their deaths as entertainment. Programs were scratched into tablets. 2 Noxii slain by beasts, 1 punished for defiance, 1 for cowardice. Nothing more. No names, no trials, no monuments. Just silence, etched in dust, but still. Men refused, despite the penalties, despite the humiliation, despite knowing what waited on the other side of stillness. Some stood unarmed, gazing into the crowd. Some turned their backs to the gates. Some sat, legs crossed, hands folded, and in that refusal, they reclaimed what the empire tried to take. A moment of autonomy, a sliver of self, a death on their terms. Because what Rome could never fully control was what the people felt when they watched. Sometimes they cheered, sometimes they laughed, but sometimes they looked away, and in that moment, The defiant gladiator had won. Not the match, but the meaning. What does it say about a society when the greatest act of rebellion is to simply stand still, and when death becomes the only place left to express? Resistance. How many must fall before the silence is finally heard? There is something uncanny about a silent arena. When the Colosseum was full, 50,000 people packed under awnings, the sun pouring in through linen sails, the air thick with sweat, wine, and anticipation. Stillness didn't belong. The crowd came for noise, for the clash of swords, for blood sprayed across sand, for shouts, grunts, roars. But when a gladiator refused to fight, and silence stretched longer than expected, the crowd grew restless. And when that stillness held, there's an account from the reign of Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher emperor, of an African gladiator named Vindex. A former soldier enslaved for desertion, Vindex was a seasoned fighter, skilled, brutal, undefeated. But one day, he entered the arena, raised his sword, and drove it into the sand. He did not speak. He did not resist. He simply sat, legs folded beneath him, and waited. The crowd roared, then booed, then went silent. No one knew what to do. The emperor, seated above, reportedly left the amphitheater early. Vindex was flogged, beaten, tied to a post and executed the following morning before the sun had cleared the rim of the walls. But people remembered. Years later, soldiers still spoke his name, not as a hero, not as a coward, but as something else. A man who reminded Rome, just for a moment, that the games were not inevitable. That was the power of refusal. It disrupted the ritual. Because the Colosseum wasn't just for killing, it was for teaching. It taught citizens to love Rome, to trust the system, to fear disorder, to accept cruelty as entertainment, and death as background noise. But when someone refused to play their part, when a man stood still while the world demanded blood, the gears ground to a halt, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loud. There are carved graffiti in Pompeii that show gladiators standing over fallen foes. Others show them, raising their arms, seeking mercy. But in one lesser-known house, along a quieter street, a charcoal sketch was found. A lone figure, arms out, sword laid at his feet. No opponent, no crowd. Just the man, beside him, scrawled in crude Latin, non ludit. He does not play, not he does not fight, not he does not kill. He does not play, as if to say, this is all a game, and I am done playing. Historians argue about the frequency of such refusals. Some believe they were rare, exaggerated for effect. Others think they were more common than the records suggest, but deliberately underreported. After all, the empire controlled the narrative, and the last thing Rome wanted people to see was that even its most tightly controlled stage could fall apart. Not through rebellion, but through simple stillness. Because if one slave could stop the show, what else might the crowd start questioning? And yet, the show always resumed. The blood was washed away, the sand raked, the trumpet sounded again. Another man stepped into the arena. This time, he fought, and the crowd cheered, and the memory of silence faded until the next time, because silence is fragile, but it always returns. In the end, the penalties for refusal never changed the truth, that in a city built on control, the greatest act of resistance was not fire or sword, but a man standing still, in the heat, under the eyes of thousands, choosing not to play. And while Rome punished the body, the idea remained. An idea that long outlasted the games. An idea buried beneath the stone, beneath the dust, beneath the roar that once drowned out everything except the sound of a single sword. Falling. In the heart of Rome, just behind the Forum, there stood a small sacred structure. Round, domed, quiet. The Temple of Vesta. Its flame never went out. Its floor was swept clean each day, and inside, for over 1,000 years, young women lived lives of silence, discipline, and reverence. They were called the Vestal Virgins, chosen as children, sworn to 30 years of celibacy and ritual, guardians of the hearth, of Rome's eternal flame, of the city's divine favor. They lived like priestesses, were honored like nobility, and punished like criminals when they failed. Because the one thing a Vestal Virgin could never do was fall in love. The Vestals were among the most revered women in Roman society. Handpicked before puberty, they were chosen from noble families to serve Vesta, goddess of the hearth. Once selected, they left their families and entered a life of sacred seclusion in the house of the Vestals, a cloistered residence beside the temple. Their duties were precise: keep the eternal flame burning, tend sacred objects, perform purification. Rites maintain perfect chastity. In return, they were granted privileges few Roman women ever dreamed of. They could own property, make wills, ride in carriages, sit in prominent seats at games, speak freely in court. But these freedoms came at a cost. Because the moment they broke their vow of virginity, the law did not treat them as women. It treated them as cursed objects, as vessels that had failed the gods. The punishment for a Vestal Virgin who broke her vow was not torture, nor was it execution in the usual Roman sense. No fire, no sword, no crucifix. The punishment was burial alive, because her blood could not be spilled, because she was sacred, because the goddess must not be offended by gore. So instead, the ritual was clinical, quiet, formal. Here is how it was done. When a Vestal was suspected of impurity, the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, conducted an investigation. There was no trial in the modern sense, no defense counsel, no appeals. If found guilty, the sentence was carried out immediately. A small underground chamber was prepared, just outside the city's walls, near the Colline Gate. It contained a bed, a lamp, a loaf of bread, and a small vessel of water. She would be dressed in white, led through the city in silence. Citizens would line the streets, some mourning, some curious, some afraid. The Pontifex Maximus would recite a prayer, raise his hands, and then step back, and the Vestal Virgin, one of the most powerful women in Rome, would descend the steps into the earth. The opening would be sealed behind her, and she would be left to die. This punishment was not about cruelty. It was about restoring balance. Romans believed that the purity of the Vestals protected the city. If one failed, the gods were angry. Floods, famine, or plague might follow. So her death wasn't just punishment, it was atonement. It was exorcism by entombment. Sometimes the man she was accused of loving was punished too. Unlike the Vestal, his blood could be spilled, and so it often was, by flogging, beheading, or being thrown from the Tarpeian rock, a steep cliff on the Capitoline Hill reserved for traitors and those who betrayed Rome. This man might be a soldier, a noble, a slave. No rank could save him if he was accused of defiling Rome's most sacred woman. And yet, accusations were not always pure. Political enemies sometimes used the charge of vestal impurity as a weapon. Because the Pontifex Maximus was often the emperor himself, or closely tied to the ruling elite, the lines between justice and politics blurred. Accusing a vestal meant accusing her entire family of impurity, and in Rome, that meant exile, disgrace, or worse. It was a punishment that not only silenced the woman, it tainted her bloodline. There are only a few recorded instances of this burial punishment being carried out. In 483 BCE, the Vestal Oppia was buried alive for impurity. In 216 BCE, during the Punic Wars, 2 Vestals, Opimia and Floronia, were found guilty. One was buried, the other committed suicide before the sentence under the Emperor Domitian. In the 1st century CE, 3 Vestals were punished. One, Cornelia, was famously reported to have protested her innocence as she descended into the chamber. "I have done nothing. I am pure. The goddess knows it." The dirt was shoveled in anyway. The cruelty of it lies in its cleanliness. No screams, no blood, only silence and soil. Rome called it justice, but to many it felt like sacrificial burial, as though the Vestal herself became an offering to the angry gods, and perhaps she was. But what does it say about a civilization that honored a woman more than any other, until the moment she stepped outside the line? And how many of those buried beneath the Colline Gate were guilty? And how many were just no longer convenient? The strangest thing about burying someone alive is that the world above doesn't change. The carts still roll past. The forum still fills with chatter. The fountains still flow. But beneath the soil, in a sealed chamber just big enough for one bed and one breath, a young woman waits for the gods to decide whether she deserves to be remembered. And the people of Rome, they look away, because to dwell too long on a Vestal's burial is to question the balance of the world itself. The Colline Gate chamber was always built the same way. A narrow staircase led down to a stone vault. A lamp was left burning, a small dish of water, a loaf of bread, sometimes a little milk for ceremony. These were not given out of compassion. They were placed to satisfy religious requirements, to show that Rome